I am an orientation and mobility specialist.
I'm a lawyer.
I'm a firefighter.
I'm an advocate.
I'm a sister.
I am a mother.
I'm a friend.
I am me.
I have bipolar disorder.
Depression.
On borderline personality.
I'm not embarrassed.
1 out of 5 people lives with a mental health condition.
We're all people, and if we talk about it, there's hope.
Hello, everybody. I'm Matt Smith. I'm a board member for the Erie County Anti-Stigma Coalition. And on behalf of that group, I'd like to welcome you to the 13th in our series of Facebook Live events. This time, we're focusing on the state of stigma, first responders, stress, trauma, and mental health. All of us experience in our daily lives, and many of us at a given point in time will experience something that could be called some sort of trauma. And all of us experience stress on a daily basis, but most people don't experience the level of stress and trauma that our first responders deal with regularly, some even really on a daily basis. What is it like? What mental health challenges can result from so much regular stress and trauma? What is being done to help our first responders deal with those challenges? In the next hour, we will discuss the mental health challenges present in the first responder community, the role of stigma in those challenges, and what's being done to help our first responder mental wellness as they go about their crucial jobs. We are fortunate to have a panel of 4 local experts willing to lend their perspective as we attempt to answer these questions. Now, before I introduce our panelists, here are a couple of housekeeping rules. Our program is for 1 hour. During this time, if you have a question or comment, please type it in the chat box and we will respond accordingly. Your questions often lead to some great dialogue, so please don't be shy. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panelists. First, Sarah Bonk is the assistant to the Erie County Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, where she works to assist first responders of all types. She's a New York licensed state social worker with 10 years of experience in the crisis mental health system. Sarah graduated from the University of Buffalo School of Social Work program and went on to be a founding member of the police behavioral health response teams. Sarah spent her career responding to mental health crisis 911 calls with law enforcement.
Thank you very much for having me.
Very welcome. Thanks for joining us. Steve Bigner is the fire chaplain for Erie County Emergency Services and a pastor in the Lutheran Church in Western New York. He is passionate about the emotional, physical, and spiritual health of Western New York's professional, volunteer, and career first responders. He and his wife, Michelle, also have a counseling practice in Clarence. Welcome, Steve.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me be a part of it.
Glad to have you. Next up, Lieutenant Jeffrey Schmidt. He has served with the Cheektowaga Police Department since 2006. He is currently in charge of their Community Resources Unit and their Behavioral Health Team. In addition, Jeffrey has volunteered his time as a peer for the WNYLE helpline. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you. Our last panelist is Daniel Neverth Jr. He is the Erie County Commissioner of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, where he oversees disaster preparedness, EMS, fire safety, and protective services. A volunteer firefighter for 30 years, Dan has served as the chief of the Hillcrest Fire Department and Orchard Park Fire District. He's an adjunct instructor for New York State Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. He's also the Buffalo Bills Game Day Emergency Management Coordinator. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks for having me, and thanks to all of our other panelists. It should be a terrific show.
Wonderful to have all of you here today for the next hour. Let's get right to it. I think I'll start with Sarah. We talk about stress all the time, but what does it really look like in terms of what stressors are present for firefighters, police? What does the average day look like for our first responders right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that one of the biggest things that we don't often talk about when we talk about stigma is the stress that we all experience on a day-to-day basis, then compounded with the stress that first responders experience. So whether that's the stress of not knowing when that first call is going to come out or what type of scene you're going to respond to. But there's a different type of stress that we notice first responders experiencing to now, which is the stress in the aftermath of an event as well. What does that recovery period look like? Because there's a lot of experience in terms of the aftermath of their day-to-day routine, right? First responders are great. They have great coping skills, very adaptive in terms of compartmentalization and the ability to be resilient. But what we see is that the stacking of those experiences from that long-term work on the job can over time lead to those demonstrations of stress, and whether that what that ends up looking like often can be individualized for individuals.
Yeah, I imagine there's just the general workaday that any other job would have, but then of course, when the stakes are as high as they are, I imagine it might be even more stressful and more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely.
Appreciate
that very much. Dan, anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's something that that for me personally has popped up, and I think it's something that maybe goes a little bit deeper into the whole mental health question. Is specific to incidents that happen that maybe you're not directly connected to. I think there's a whole area of research that could potentially be done, because as we advance in our careers, we take more training, we become more qualified in certain areas. And as incidents happen not only around the world, but in our own backyards, if you're not specifically responding to them, but you have a training level that rises to that, you're analyzing what's going on, you're feeling a part of it, but you're also somewhat disconnected. So whereas there's that gradual over the years wear and tear emotionally, I think one of the other things too that I've noticed more and more is there's also a wear and tear by not being directly involved, but still being emotionally involved in that incident itself. So I'm blessed to have Steve on our staff here. He calls, checks up on me on a regular basis. Sarah is now literally right across the hall from me, to be able to help with those things. But I think it's really important that we focus on a lot of different things. You have that initial impact from a first responder new to it, maybe that first catastrophic event, maybe that they're responding to all the way through. It's a gradual, but it's a cumulative impact, I think, that it has on folks. So you have that initial shock of a young person that's with a fire department, a police agency that you really need to focus on. But I think down the line too, as you become 10 years, 15 years, 20, or even more into the process, I think there are still impactful things that maybe aren't necessarily directly related to the call you're on.
Okay. Steve, I know you're available for lots of people, and you do talk with a lot of first responders. What are some of the things that some of the first responders are coming to you with?
Well, it's interesting. I think the point that Dan makes is excellent, because it's not always just the call that they came back from. It's sometimes the call from 5 years ago, or the call from 10 years ago, or in many cases 30 years ago. And those are some of the ones that maybe 30 years ago, the stigma was so strong at that point that folks didn't go and get help for. They didn't talk with a counselor. They didn't really share their feelings around what they were carrying. So they've literally been carrying some of these calls for 20 years. And so sometimes it's not the call, it's the call that reminded us of the last call. And, I always use the illustration with our responders of their backpack of calls. And when you go to one, you throw it in the backpack and you move on to the next call. And some of our departments are going out, on rough days for our volunteer professionals. They're going out 5 and 6 and 7 times a day and trying to also have a full-time job and a family. And so they don't take the time to do that. So they're carrying a lot of stress around from years of serving the community.
Thanks for that. I'd like a little bit of a snapshot from Jeffrey, if I could, about the day-to-day. When a policeman comes to work, how does that day look? You've all seen TV shows, but you're actually living this. How as the day goes on, what would you characterize as stressful, or do you just get used to some of it?
So it's hard to say, because with each department, every single place you go operates a little bit differently depending on how many people you have on the road, how busy your organization is. You could end up being on midnights, which your call volume is very lighter, but then the types of calls that you see are much more exotic. So there's really no average net that you can cast out to say this is what the life is like for a first responder. Even to talk about how different the life is for an ambulance worker versus a policeman versus a fireman, there's really no way to say this is how it is. The similarity that every single one has in common is that you go from a baseline of 0 to just what's in your personal life, whatever you're dealing with there, your emotional stressors at home and in the community. And then at some point during your shift, you have to take that, compartmentalize it, And then it goes up to a high stress situation, a call that you have to respond to, some situation that you have to deal with that is not normal. It's an abnormal situation. Then once that call is over, you're expected to immediately return back to that baseline of 0 and still balance between your personal life and your work life. That's a pretty difficult balance to find.
Sounds like it would be. We've obviously everybody's been through some difficulties of late, with COVID, the opioid epidemic, the recent violent events. How have any of these added to the stress or trauma that first responders deal with on a regular basis? Sarah, can we start with you?
Sure, and that's a large question, and it's interesting that you ask it. And I was talking about it with some of my fellow mental health first responders the other day, and that a lot of us in the first response community didn't necessarily experience COVID in the same way, where we were stuck at home and we still had kind of obligations and duties out in the field, and people were still using 911 and still calling and still experiencing a variety of emergencies and crisis. So from the mental health first responder community, we found that there's almost this gap of time that we went through with COVID, and everything that happened in that period of time is just another kind of layer to us in our service to the community. So we haven't been able to take that step back yet to be able to say, okay, what did we go through now as those mental health first responders, and how do we look at recovery and our own needs? So from the perspective of addressing how have we done that yet, I don't know that I have a great answer for you, Matt, because we're just kind of in that process now of, okay, how do we address our own needs after a significant accumulation of events for the mental health first responders in the community.
That's fair. I totally get that. Steve, anything to add to that?
Well, two things that I saw during COVID and now in the fire service, the day room. There's in every fire hall. There's usually a place that folks can go back and have a soda or a couple pops or water or other things. And after a bad call, they come back together and they talk and they do share. And so, at least that stigma of even sharing just a little bit about what you experienced on the call and how you're doing and just checking in happens in that 40 minutes, hour afterwards before you go home. When COVID happened, most of our day rooms in our firehouses were closed. So folks had to arrive at a firehouse, go out and do this call, and then come back to jump in their car and go back home. And as Lieutenant said, you go back home and you're expected to be right back where you were, but you're still highly anxious from whatever scene you were on. And now I'm noticing that even with our responders and our career responders, there's more and more of them that are out because of COVID. And yes, the strain isn't as bad, but now it's balancing the shift schedules and people on overtime. And so you have less people doing more work. And so they're experiencing more trauma than they normally would.
That's interesting. I guess everyone, the isolation and the rules that have changed, which, try to keep people from being too close together for too long, would spill over into every workplace. And that's really kind of unfortunate that happened. Dan, have you seen anything different?
I would echo what Steve said with regards to the ability to be able to decompress. Most fire stations were pretty much shut down with the exception of calls themselves. You'd come in, you do what you needed to do, and then you exited fairly quickly on the volunteer side of things. So I did definitely see that. It was an extended period of time where there's a lot of wear and tear, the usual mechanisms of identifying if maybe somebody could use a little boost, could use some of the resources that we have at our ability. As a former chief, you like to start with a discussion with the individual, but that isolation that took place really didn't allow for that. So your ability to examine, do a snap unprofessional judgment on a person was completely eliminated for almost 2 years.
Mm-hmm. That's tough. I'm thinking about the more recent violent events that have happened. What has that done in terms of the overall morale or mood or stress level for first responders? Jeff, could you start?
So what we're seeing a lot of is that it's not the actual events themselves. The events unfold just like any type of emergency event where you respond to a scene, you assess what the scene is, and then you get into the business of making that scene safe and solving a problem. The bigger mental impact we're seeing is from the coverage of these events. It's from the perception of what's put on our officers, because when they leave here, they still listen to the radio, they still see the news that everyone else is seeing. If they're active on social media, they get bombarded by this imagery from a lot of different places that it doesn't actually always reflect the way things actually are in our communities. And it's mostly negative what they're bombarded with. And that's been the bigger problem.
Okay, that makes sense. So right now, what mental health challenges are we seeing manifest themselves in this community? Sarah, would you like to start?
Yeah, and I think, where do you want to start? In speaking of the community members' experience, their
Sure.
experience in trauma will look like one thing. For us in the mental health first response community, again, I don't say this to divert the question, but we are still providing services or trying to provide services for the community. So for us, it's really trying to balance our own heartbreak for the community with needing to be there to be able to provide any assistance for what that looks like. So it looks in us like extra stress, or maybe not getting that extra load of laundry done at home because our minds aren't always present, even when we're off the job. Maybe some of those stories we've heard or had to sit with people have come home and we're watching TV, but we're not really watching, or we're not necessarily engaged. And so when you look at the mental health first responders, how the recent trauma has impacted us, I think is going to be something that continues to be uncovered the longer that we go on past the event.
No doubt, no doubt. But in the present time right now, Steve, I know you're a counselor. What are we seeing in terms of people coming forward?
Well, what we're seeing is there's not enough space for people in offices with counselors right now. We have a severe shortage. If you want to see your counseling business grow, have a global pandemic, because everyone's depression and anxiety, just on a general level around our whole society, increased. And so everyone from teenagers to 70-year-olds are dealing with a higher level of stress. So you clog up those patient hours, and now our first responders that are dealing more with critical incident stress don't have the ability to go and find those trusted folks. We also in the Western New York area are blessed with a lot of resources for mental health that are built into the county services and our other debriefing teams. But we do have a shortage of folks that understand the first responder culture. And it is a different culture than working at a bank or working in a school. And so the level of stress that they're dealing with on a daily basis, the sarcasm, all of the things that come with that group of people is a little bit different than your normal human beings. We say we're wired differently, and on some levels that's needed and necessary for the work that's being done. But it's also harder to decompress and process some of the tough stuff that they need to work through.
I imagine. When you say sarcasm, you mean just like what humor people are using to deal with getting by, and in people in the field.
Yeah, it might look to an outsider as a little bit more rough or poking fun at one another, really, busting chops. But that's just one of the things that happens in an ambulance bay, in a barracks, and in a firehouse.
I wonder about often about some of the negative public feelings about law enforcement specifically, and about this right now, and how is that weighing on our first responder community when that sort of stuff peaks and that sort of stuff shows up. Jeff, you care to comment on that?
Yeah, so it's always a tough area. It's hard to put it in a category just saying like, oh yeah, people would almost say, oh, people hate us. How can you do that job anymore? I can't believe that anybody would sign up to do that job. I find that the reality is very different when you're here, when you're doing it. I find that the majority of our communities are engaged in the business of being favorable to law enforcement. What's striking though is that most of our officers are only dealing with people on their worst day. And when people are having their worst day, those types of feelings are not the ones that come over. So when you are dealing with people constantly in these stressful situations, and their connotation of you is negative, and then you additionally have it reported to you that all people are against the police, they don't like the police, that certainly can weigh on people's minds. There's no solution for it. There's no fix for it. It's not like I can say to someone, hey, you should feel great that everybody's saying that they don't like you or respect you. I wish there was a simple fix.
Well, I was wondering about how that was weighing on the morale of officers and what you do to try to handle that. So I guess talking about is a big part of that. Let's shift gears a little bit. With mental health knowledge and the handle is a big part of what you all need to do. So what sort of training is offered on mental health for first responders of different types? Dan, could you start?
Well, I would say as far as training, it really depends on the volunteer side of things. It's addressing to the younger members and even those that have been around for as long as I have. The resources that we have with regards to EAP, depending on whether or not you're fortunate enough to have that, the county provides that resource to county employees. But I think really it's an educational type thing that we could do a better job. I'm not gonna list the number of different things that we have in our back pocket or our toolkit to be able to do, because it really starts with, first and foremost, identifying that a person could use that. We do have critical stress debriefing teams that come out to try and do that initial decompression after a major incident, but that really relies on the chief or one of the lieutenants or someone within that organization identifying, hey, it would be a good idea to take this first step. And then from there, we progress into other areas. As the panel has noted, there's any number of professional services out there that we can ultimately refer people to. But unless you identify that, and I really do believe in the first responder community, it needs to be a team effort. It can't be just an individual reaching within themselves and saying, hey, by the way, I could really talk to somebody. That happens, that's awesome. But I think it's a team effort because the first response community is one team. And I think as such, we need to be able to do a better job with that.
Okay. Is there any kind of at least introductory blanket mental health 101? Here's some of the different conditions you might see, that sort of thing, that's part of the training with the different first responders?
Well, if I could speak on behalf of fire and EMS, I mean, it's so diverse throughout the county and throughout the country. I mean, in the city of Buffalo, you have paid professionals, and the volunteer ranks, you have unpaid professionals that come to a call and then scatter about and go about their business, go back to their offices or go back to their families. So there's not that culture of you come back from a call and you're gathered together. So I think it's really difficult. You can't throw a blanket over any one thing when it comes to that community. And I think the further out you go into the suburbs, the more difficult that becomes, because you incorporate things maybe in your initial training with regards to that. EMT training adds components to that. We do have chaplains that do a phenomenal job that get out and try and make that message known. But again, it can fall through. And don't forget, volunteer fire companies are an annual election. So your chief is maybe hip and understands exactly what needs to be done this year if somebody's struggling. But then next year, it's somebody that maybe has no idea what the programs are. So it's not a culture of you go from an officer to a lieutenant to an assistant chief or a captain. You move up the ranks, you move back into the ranks. And it's really depends on what community you're in. There's no consistency.
That's an interesting challenge. Anybody care to speak to that?
I can speak to I really appreciate what the commissioner's bringing up, that every fire hall changes. That's the one thing you can guarantee is change. And so you don't know who's coming in and how do they back what you want to do? Is this something that's important to them? It may or it may not be. One of the shifts that we've made is our research shows us that our first responders are moving through traumatic events in a more healthy pattern if they've had pre-incident resiliency training. So our stress debriefing team goes in after something terrible happens. But what we try and do is take some of that information out now and do the training, especially for our younger responders, before they go into these traumatic events. And what we can do is teach them, hey, your body is going to react this way, your soul, your mind, your spirit, all of these things are going to happen to them, so that when they have them happen, they can say, oh, that's right, this is okay, this is normal. I'm not losing my mind if I'm waking up at night with nightmares. This is part of the normal response of resetting and return to normal adaptive behavior. So we are trying to push more and more to be training our fire departments, especially in pre-incident training, as opposed to just coming in after the call.
Well, that's great. What about police? How much of that is going on? And I know, Jeffrey, if you could talk about your own experience, what kind of training have you received about this?
So the training is there. Officers receive two types of training in mental health. There's the training that we get in order to help others in crisis, whereas there's schools that run right out of the Municipal Police Training Council, designed to set goals for our officers to learn how to deal with people in crisis. But then there's a flip side where officers are able to engage in training that teaches them about self-care. We have wellness coordinators are starting to pop up at the departments, and that's guided through the state comes out with these program platforms of what a police department should have for critical. And the big thing is the critical incident stress model that's being adopted across our local Western New York law enforcement community, where if a critical incident happens, there are resources in order to bring people in for debriefings, coupled with a peer support model to have officers right inside the department to identify other officers who may be struggling, may be having a hard time, not just with the big events, but with the every other day-to-day life. We have the law enforcement helpline, which is established in the area, and that's a huge thing. It's not just for law enforcement, it's for all types of first responders. There's volunteer peers who work for this helpline that you can call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they will engage with you. If you're a law enforcement member, if you are a family law enforcement, if you are in corrections, if you are a dispatcher, if you are a ambulance worker, I mean, you name it, we have somebody there who's walked the same path you have, so that if nothing else, at the end of the day, they can kind of share a moment and say, I understand the stressors you're going through. I've walked a bit of that same path myself. I hear the things you're saying, and to reflect with them that, yeah, what you're explaining, 10 out of 10 is going to be a very normal reaction to a very abnormal event. And that's the biggest thing that we're doing in law enforcement, is trying to support each other in that way.
That's great. We'll be putting that hotline number up again several times throughout the course of the show. If anyone is just joining us, I'm Matt Smith from the Erie County Anti-Stigma Coalition, and I'm joined by Sarah, who is the assistant to the Erie County Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, Steve Bigner, who is the fire chaplain for Erie County Emergency Services, Lieutenant Jeffrey Schmidt of the Cheektowaga Police Department, and Daniel Neverett Jr., the Erie County Commissioner of Homeland Security and Emergency Services. We've been discussing stress and trauma among first responders, and we'll be moving into supports and the role of overcoming stigma in those efforts momentarily. If you and check out our website, letstalkstigma.org, and maybe join the nearly 4,000 others in taking the pledge to end stigma. Also, if you are connected with a business, organization, or faith community, you can become an organizational member of the Anti-Stigma Coalition. You can find information for this on the website under the members tab. Okay, now back to our panelists. So I'm always interested in really kind of snapshots and peeks into people's lives. And we talked a little bit about this, but I would like to go a little bit deeper into when a first responder is part of a traumatic event. I know it's going to vary, but I'd like to hear from each of you. What happens? What kicks in, what supports are offered? I don't know. Sarah, do you want to go first?
Sure. And I apologize for my technical issues. I'm not sure what was going on there.
Just glad you're back.
The first thing that happens, at least in the mental health community, is a check-in with one of our peers, is that initial debriefing after an incident, whether we responded to it in pairs, or that means we have a kind of a check-in that's scheduled with our supervisor. Outside of that, part of our professional training and upbringing is to ensure that we're doing our due diligence to constantly manage those things, but then to make sure that we are kind of paying attuned to them within ourselves and within our mental health colleagues. And so we don't have necessarily a uniform process in terms of debriefing or, a structured interview that will have clinicians come in, but it's a very informal process at this point. But there's always room to reevaluate. And in fact, as we talk about these conversations, and especially as we address the stigma within our own community, within the mental health community, making sure that we get our needs addressed as well, we really want to look at what policies and process can we put in place to ensure that we are addressing the needs of our mental health first responders after they respond to an incident.
So I know that, I think, Steve, you brought up the room that people would go into afterwards toward the end of their shift. So again, please take us through that. So what that they return back to the firehouse and there's an opportunity to talk to each other, or is it a formal thing or what?
Well, it could be both, depending on the nature of the incident. Chaplains across, we have 4 active chaplains across Erie County. We know what calls that are important for us to be on scene for: fire, loss of life, children involved, entrapment. And we can also tell you can tell over the radio already from the voice of the incident commander. And if their level of stress is going up on the radio, that those are good ones to be at. So some of that really starts on scene, to be able to at least take a look at the baseline of our responders and check in to see how they're doing. Our mental health responders, our chaplains might pull them aside and just say, hey, let's check in on scene. But part of those protocols that they go through training are there to protect them, not only with their turnout gear for fire or, tough events, but also mental health wise. When they come back to their firehouse, we sometimes do something just called a diffusion, which we get everyone together who is on the scene and make sure everyone's on the same page. You'll have folks that are first in and saw some terrible things. You've got some folks that were there but didn't see what was happening. You've got some folks that are doing fire police and are half mile down the road. But all of them were sort of part of this event, and it's important to get them on the same page. So we do some intentional work there, and then a lot of them go and have a pop together and talk about it or process it. Some families really appreciate when their responders keep their stuff in their day room and they talk to their crew about it, because once they come home, they need them to, cook dinner and change a diaper and mow the lawn. But some family members also want to help them go through that processing after the event.
Thank you for that. I know one thing that keeps coming up is that there's not one singular way that all this stuff gets handled. So Dan, how much does it vary? And is it necessary to try to think about having it vary less, or is it okay the way that it is? What do you think?
Well, I think first and foremost, you have to have the resources to be able to deal with the issue at hand. The incident itself it starts with a microprocessor that is you. So you're dealing with something, whether you're directly involved with the patient and or the incident itself. So you start there. You're dealing with your processing. As Steve said, you come back to the fire station. We'll do an after action. Sometimes it's not right away. Sometimes you let everybody just settle in for a little bit. You come back the next day. The after action, again, it's very critical, I think, that even if you're not directly involved with the incident itself, if you're a fire police person who happens to be a mile away, you're still actively a part of that incident. So then you start collectively with those that were involved in it. You then maybe have a stress debriefing after and after action, depending on what you're seeing. And then you expand that. If you're fortunate enough to have family members that want to be involved in that and helping you to unpack that suitcase, then that's really good too. And I think that expands to a lot of our families are actively involved in this process. And that then potentially pushes an untrained person into that role. Now they have some baggage of their own. So you have to be able to analyze that too. So you have to be able to take a look at these things as they progress. But it all starts with the individual, first of all, dealing with processing, because we've all, I think everybody on this call has been involved in a traumatic incident. And then what happens is, what you're trying to actually deal with that. So, you're working through, but it's based on your professional skills. Have you been trained to deal with that where maybe personally it's not as traumatic versus maybe a new member of a fire station that is at their first cardiac arrest or their first childbirth or their first major accident that hasn't yet gone through that training regimen. So it's complex, and to say you could throw one blanket over it all, I think having something ultimately that we can refer people to, but also incorporating in that basic training the mental health component, similar to what law enforcement has been doing a very good job on for the last decade.
You know, a couple of us have now gone into a question that I was saving for later, but we might as well talk about it now. So, family members, loved ones, what can loved ones do to really support people we care about? What are we really asking for them to do? What do you think that their best role is to help? Can we start with you, Lieutenant Schmidt?
Is it sounding okay? I'm getting a little bit of feedback, I think, over here. Can everyone understand me?
We got you. We got you. Keep going.
So moving into that, before we get completely off the last question, I just wanted to say that we are doing a lot better as a law enforcement community as a whole, especially in this area. But a huge problem that we're seeing with the stigma is the idea of the traumatic event itself. So it is easy to figure out some stuff. You're involved in a shooting, traumatic event, a major traffic accident where somebody has severe injuries, traumatic event, children who get injured, traumatic event. But what we're missing is a little bit of your trauma is not my trauma. And we will have officers who can go to an event like a stabbing, and they can walk away from that without any real emotional baggage or damage from it, without having it really getting impacted by the trauma. Meanwhile, the things that we're missing are those everyday traumas. An officer goes to a call, a first responder goes to a call where just the way that the mother is interacting with their child brings up a personal trauma in that life, and it's very extraordinarily affecting. So those types of traumas is what we're seeing officers start to suffer in silence because there are no supports built in for that. What we try to rely on is the more of a peer support system. We rely on our supervisors to observe behaviors. So if somebody goes off baseline, you can kind of track them, isolate them, and try and determine what it is that is affecting their performance, affecting their mood, so that they can deal with these events that to them are personally traumatic, even though we may not say, yes, that's a trauma just by looking at it on its face. That's a huge thing to deal with, because if I'm hurting inside because of a call, but I don't feel that it's big enough, if I don't feel that it qualifies, other people have it worse than me, we find that those voices stay silent. For family members, I would encourage family members to reach out to agencies. It's not like it used to be. 30 years ago, if you were to reach out as a family member to an organization, a fire department, a police department, you wouldn't meet with open arms. You would meet with a little bit of coming up against the good old boys network, so to speak, or who are you trying to get into our culture, into our business? Now it's much more of a culture being very involved in the business of keeping our people mentally well. So if family members have concerns about their loved ones, we encourage them to come forward and engage with us in a dialogue so that we can try and get them some help before it spirals out of control and becomes a problem. And that's a main goal of ours, is to identify things that are starting to build and to offer support and structure so that it can get mediated out. Just by talking about things sometimes is enough to go back to the backpack analogy. If you just fill up your backpack with rocks and you got boulders in there, just by talking about it, you can knock off some of that boulder, make the load a little bit easier to carry. So that's the message we have. And again, I go back to the law enforcement helpline. We're very fortunate to have that in this area. That's for family members too. So you're the wife of a policeman. That's not an easy life. It's not. I grew up in a law enforcement home, being the child of a police officer, and it's not always an easy life. Things go out on the news. I was in high school about the time that Rodney King happened, and then suddenly you're dealing with these conflicting emotions of people have a problem suddenly with your family, with your father, with their livelihood, and they want to tell you about it. That can be a very confusing and stressful time. Well, they didn't have anything like this when I was a kid. I wish they did. Those family members can call, and we have other family members of law enforcement who can talk to them about the way that makes them feel, who understand those types of stressors and burdens. And then I should say that that helpline 100%, there's no counselors on it. We're not there to be social workers or to offer any type of clinical help or advice. We're really just there to listen, to identify with maybe common ground that we can share to say, yep, that is a very hard situation in a way that people in your ordinary life, regular civilians, just don't understand. There is a break in communication there.
So it's a peer line, is what it is. That's who's actually taking the phone calls.
Yes.
For peers, and it's for family members and anyone attached to anyone in law enforcement, but other first responders as well.
Yes, we have everybody. So corrections guards, ambulance workers, dispatchers, law enforcement officers, if you name it, and all their family members. And the best part is, let's say that you're sitting there thinking, well, I don't qualify. Call us and we will find out. If we don't have somebody for you, we'll find a place you belong. We don't turn anybody away. We're not going to say, oh, you know what? You don't qualify in our hierarchy of who we're going to help today and hang up on you. That's not going to happen. We're going to sit there. We're going to listen to you. And if you need a higher level of care, we can link you with that too. We can find out what a real good first step is for you to go to somewhere if just talking about it isn't enough.
Thank you for all that, Jeffrey. This is all great information. The line is appearing on the bottom of the screen right now. So please do take note, people who'd like to use that. Aside from the getting of those sorts of supports and services, what else could family members do, just maybe in the home, just for themselves with their law enforcement or their first responder loved one? What do you think, Steve?
Well, we take a lot of time in our trainings to start talking about exfil and reentry into the house. So for professional volunteers, many of their calls come and they have to get up from the dinner table or walk away from a family gathering. And sometimes the family is not real thrilled about that, and yet they still are called into service. And then if they go into some sort of stress-filled and traumatic event, again, they come home to that. And there needs to be a lot of communication about what is the best way for us as a couple. And as the commissioner said before, there's no blanket to put on this either, because we have fire chiefs whose spouses go to calls when they're in the truck and they like to go. And we have fire chiefs that they don't want anything to do. Their spouses don't want anything to do with the calls. So some of their families see things because they are called and you have a fire hall truck and they have to go straight to the scene and they don't have time to drop their family off. And so I spend time sometimes talking with family for 45 minutes who are sitting in the front seat of a truck while their spouse is out serving the community. So it's all about communication about what works best for that family system. And what are the ways that when you leave the house or come back in, that can be handled the best way possible. We include the families, in some of our trainings as well. Invite them to see what does trauma do spiritually, behaviorally, cognitively, emotionally to your responder, and how are you able to talk about those aspects?
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Again, we're the Anti-Stigma Coalition, so we're going to make sure we get back into the stigma. We started to talk about it a little bit, but I'd like to get back to that now. The state of the stigma right now in this community. What does stigma look like? How big an issue is it still? Sarah, can you comment on that?
I would argue to say that stigma is very present and relevant, not only in our community, but in every community. It's something that if it's not at the forefront of our work in terms of how we communicate about this sort of topic and how we communicate about really a variety of topics, lends itself on a day-to-day basis to how we think about stigma, right? So even as we talk about certain people, like in the mental health field, people will laugh if you were to ask. I always would correct individuals. That's not the schizophrenic person necessarily, it's the person with schizophrenia. So really making sure that in our language choices on a day-to-day basis, we're putting forward that mindset that we're recognizing individuals as opposed to kind of that presentation that they may be in front of us with.
Okay, that's great. I think that obviously it is an issue with everybody, but it would seem to me that in a field where bravery, courage, duty, all these wonderful traits that every first responder must embody might also be a get in the way of seeking help. What do you think, Dan? Is that still a problem?
Well, it's kind of interesting because there's a saying that we use in the fire service that the fire service is 200 years of history unimpeded by progress. But I can tell you that is anything but the truth. But it does take time to evolve. It does take time to get into the things that you need to get into, to unwrap and to advance a project that truly not only impacts the lives of your members, but this whole mental health issue here also reflects very, very heavily, in my opinion, on the ability to be able to retain firefighters. There's the recruitment aspect of it, but there's the retention. And I think there's a whole lot of disqualifying of individuals that say this isn't for me properly because their issues aren't addressed properly when they're actually confronted with something that can cause some mental health issues or the stigma there. So I'd use quickly as an example, you still have some old timer firefighters out there that question why you wear an air pack when you go into a building. It's taken decades for us to understand the consequences of smoke inhalation and the products that we potentially inhale when we go in there, and the residuals of the higher incidence of cancer as a result of that. So we've moved those programs to the forefront. They've been funded. We're making great strides on that. We're starting to inch forward on the mental health side of things, but I think there does need to be a more consistent program out there. And I think that does start, as the lieutenant said, with training, with that basic training. That should probably be one of the first things that a firefighter or an EMT is exposed to, regardless of whether they happen to be Buffalo Fire Department or the Orchard Park Fire District. So I think we need to pay attention to that because that adds to the longevity of those individuals. So the stigma, yes, is still there, but I don't think it's as strong the stigma as it is maybe a little bit of confusion as to what's the next step.
So obviously we have made some progress, and there is some attitudinal kind of changes that have been going on since for a while, maybe. So compared to 10 years ago, where would you put it, and what has been done that really we could be thankful for that has caused this? Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked because I was thinking about it. I think that there has been a steady step towards advancement, especially in the reducing stigma and becoming more culturally acceptable to talk about some of these things, even in small scales, whether it's some anti-stigma campaigns through, media marketing or like the back of bus campaigns, that sort of thing, but also in how we talk about it in settings. We found that law enforcement's been gracious to accept mental health professionals into their setting and kind of into their house, if you will. And through that acceptance, a little bit of our language and our insights of mental health and our way of looking at things and kind of making sure we're keeping that stigma in check has seeped into some of these other emergency services. So I think, from my perspective, there's been significant advancements in first response and in the world of first responders in their willingness to address stigma and talk about it and really kind of come forward and share personal stories. So there's certainly work to be done, but the stepstones and the foundation has been set.
Okay, great. Jeff, would you agree? Would you, in your experience in law enforcement, are you seeing a shift?
So overall, especially being around law enforcement my whole life, I could tell you that the overall acceptance of mental health is vastly better than it was even 10 years ago. The biggest problem we have with stigma is when someone needs that second level care. That's still tough, and that's across first responders, mainly because if you get to that point where you're having an emotional problem or mental being affected to the point where you're not able to work, it steals you of your identity. So for the police, one of the things that we have to be careful of is if you get to a point where you're not mentally able to serve the community, or we have to take away your firearm. That's a huge problem for some, so much to the point because of the way it feels, it makes them look, that it's robbing them of who they are, that they won't report, they won't self-report. Same thing goes with the fire service. If I told you that I'm a fireman and all I want to do is go out and fight fires and be active, but I have to put you on desk duty, that's hard. And it's hard for anyone to look at what they believe is their identity and say, I'm going to put this all aside to get help. So that's where our greatest challenge is, I think, going forward, is make people understand that, hey, when you get to that point, that's when we want to help you the most. And it doesn't make you any weaker. It actually makes you stronger for being able to say, this is where I need support, and getting that support.
That's great. I really wonder if we can all benefit from success stories. You know, if there are any stories, and I'm not asking for names or anything like that, but I'm wondering if any of us have any stories of people who were in this field that, you know, did get help and then it ended really well for them. Steve, do you have any that you could share at all?
Yeah, and some of it comes out of the stigma piece. I really want to encourage, if one of our first responders is watching who's a veteran in your barracks or your firehouse, I have watched debriefings change when a veteran firefighter shares, and it helps reduce the stigma. Boom, it just melts away in the room. And then everyone starts sharing when they see someone that's been, you know, through difficult loss of life, the plane crash, all of that. And then suddenly they come out and start talking about their feelings and processing that. It gives everyone permission to do that. We have several of our instructors around the area in Erie County that instruct both in the county and then on the state level. And one of our fire chiefs from the Buffalo airport ends each one of his trainings that he does across the state with what he calls after the call. And it's just 15 minutes of him telling his story, working through diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder and all the some of the trauma that he has seen and some of the work that he didn't do and what that led him to in his life. And then once he started to do the work, how that changed his life and really just saved his relationship with his kids, and really just shares all that information. And you see this person as a veteran of Mercy Flight and Batavia Fire and Buffalo Fire, EMS crews. And then when they start sharing that they needed help and when they got it, it helped them. That's game-changing stuff.
Wonderful. And Jeff, have you encountered anyone who's basically come out the other end and been better for it?
Absolutely. I've been fortunate to, in volunteering my time with the helpline, experience it some that way, but I'll tell you right now that I'm a success story. Very early on in my career, I did struggle with doing this job. I did have difficulty emotionally with lining up some of the stressors and the trauma that I was dealing with. I was smart enough to reach out for help to my supervisors, and they took care of me. Back then, very different structures than what we have now, but there was an organization at the time called Catch a Falling Star, and I didn't know it, but this is what they did. They got you in, and they got you talking, and they got you to help relieve some of They explained to you that what you were feeling was a perfectly normal response to abnormal activity. And all these years later, through going through that process, I understand what it's like to hurt. I understand what it's like to heal, and I understand what it's like to be able to do this job and be affected by things. But that's okay, because you're human, and to get the help when you need it and to come out the other side smiling.
I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you, Jeffrey. That's really great. Another question, and we only have a couple of minutes left. It's been a very, very fast hour so far. We do have a couple more things to cover, but I guess one question I would ask each of you, and Dan, I'd like to start with you. What message would you have to the public in terms of how could they be supportive of first responders in this area? Do you have any kind of a message for the public?
Well, I think the lieutenant touched on it earlier. I think, unfortunately, not that I want to bash media, but I think, unfortunately, people watch the nightly news or they'll flip on the television for a while and they see snippets of bad stuff. They don't see snippets of good things. They see snippets, half a quote or whatever, when it comes to, bad things that are going on out there, whether that happens to be in the first response community or just bad people in general out there. But I think, what the public should know is the fact that, your first responders out there, especially the volunteers in all of the ring communities around the city of Buffalo. As it was noted, they're sitting having dinner and the bell goes off or the pager goes off and they're off and running. They're going from a dinner table to who knows what it could be. It could be a plane crash, 3407. It could be just a lift assist. It's any number of different things. But keep in mind, while they're sitting there enjoying their dinner, and I'm speaking from personal experience, while you're sitting there enjoying your dinner, in the back of your mind, you don't know whether that's going to happen. Are you going to get through an entire meal? Is there going to be another 3407? So that microprocessor that is the first responder is constantly going. So I think the community should just understand that these are very, very dedicated individuals. Our egos do tend to be fragile at times, but I think predominantly the public, unlike what's portrayed in the media, the public is very solid behind the first responders. So keep up the great work if you're the public that's viewing this, because these really are special individuals out there. And I know it sounds like maybe we're patting ourselves on the back, but there are a lot of things that they do, not to mention the training that they have to do, and they have to go through the family, the wear and tear on their family from time to time. So, that would be my message out there, is that it's a much, much bigger picture than guys jumping on a fire truck and going to put out a fire.
Well said. Sarah, anything to add as far as what we'd like the public to know?
Yeah, I would just like the public to know that it's okay to ask questions. If you're concerned about somebody, if we approach them with humility, honesty, and compassion, it's okay to check. And it's okay to even ask our first responders, even if they do appear to not want to talk about it, it is still okay to check in on one another.
Thank you. Jeffrey, a message to the public.
I have one of the best jobs in the world because I work in the community relations. So I get to see the best of our society, and I can tell you from personal experience that every little thing they do means a lot. When they send lunch to the stations, when they send in Facebook messages, when they just, it doesn't seem like it has a big impact, but especially for our new officers, when they get to see that and they get to be affected by it, it goes a very long way. We do see the positive end of the community. What's nice is very often I hear the phrase, you can't hate up close. And that's very true. And when we get with our community, we interact face to face, one-on-one, we find that we are very loved here.
Thank you for that. I don't want to leave you out, Steve. How about you?
Well, I guess I'm just encouraging folks recently to be responders to the responders, especially in the volunteer fire service. They're not driving, 20 minutes to go to a job. They respond in their neighborhoods. They respond to people whose homes they know. And that takes an incredible different type of toll on them, because now they're in that community all the time, and potentially also working a medical situation or a fire in someone they know. So make sure that if you know someone who is a responder in your neighborhood, whether it's volunteer or career, to please just reach out to them. And like Sarah said, with compassion and grace and mercy, just say, how are you doing? Don't ask them to retell a call. Don't ask them and trigger them by asking, what was it like? What'd you see? That's not going to help them. But just let them know how they're doing. If they're tied up in a police event for a long amount of time, go take them dinner, mow their lawn, offer to take their kids out to ice cream. But to do something to support our responders, they can actually themselves be responders to our responders.
Thank you. Very well said. As a reminder to our audience, we need you to take the pledge to end stigma by going to our website and going letstalkstigma.org. If your organization would like to join us in our cause, there's information on the website as well. Just click on the members tab to find out how. And together we can help make reducing stigma a reality and create an environment of support where help seeking and help giving are the norm. Once again, I'd like to thank our panelists, Sarah Bonk, Steve Bigner, Jeffrey Schmidt, and Daniel Neverth Jr. I'd also like to thank everyone behind the scenes, Mike Telesco from Telesco Creative Group for his vision and technical support, Carol Doggett from the Mental Health Advocates of Western New York, and Karen Karaszewski from KKPR Buffalo for their support as well. We will be on a summer break in July, but look for our next Facebook Live event in August, when our topic will be the state of stigma, how tragic events impact our mental health. This will be a look at anxiety, depression, and vicarious trauma. So many are experiencing the aftermath of recent tragedies, and we're all looking forward to that in August. Would any of you like to make a closing remark or anything? One more message. We got a minute. Anybody like anything to say? Dan, any closing, last parting shot?
No, I think the panel pretty much covered everything, and I think Steve's wraparound and as well as Sarah's and the lieutenants was perfect. So I think we can end on a positive.
I really appreciate all of you taking the time talking about this very important and compelling topic. And this will be available on our website, for the foreseeable future. So it will get everyone links so that hopefully we can spread this around and have more people see it and experience it. So grateful. Thank you very much for all the work that you do and for sharing everything that you shared today. So on behalf of the Erie County Anti-Stigma Coalition, until next time, I'm Matt Smith. Stand up to stigma and good luck on your wellness journey.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.